Good evening and welcome to Pedagogies of Healing and Practices of Reimagining, the final conversation in the Healing Higher Education, Race, Reckoning, and Reimagining series. My name is David Robinson Morris, and I'm pleased to serve as the Executive Director in service to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, more commonly known as CMIND. Before we begin tonight's dialogue and conversation, we'll begin with a brief practice. Wherever you find yourselves in the world, find a way to sit comfortably, feet firmly planted on the ground, hands relaxed, jaws unclenched. Relax your shoulders. You are safe here. Take a deep breath in. Take the deepest breath you've taken all day. Exhale. Deep breath. Exhale. Follow the rhythm of your breath. Notice in gratitude how your chest rises and falls out of love for you. You are here. You are here. Focus on the ears and listen with your heart. Wisdom from the Hopi elders. They read, "You have been telling people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Time to create your community. Be good to each other. And do not look outside of yourselves for your leader." Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We, you and I, are the ones we've been waiting for. Deep breath in, exhale. Deep breath in, exhale. Ashe. Thank you for participating in that practice. As many of you know, the Center for Contemplative Mind is a global community of practitioners and scholars working at the intersection of contemplative justice and higher education. We work to inspire, to engage, and to support the integration of contemplative practices and understandings in our everyday living toward the development of a more just world, a deepened understanding of our shared humanity, a deepened understanding of our responsibility to the planet, and to the production of new knowledges. CMIND convenes conferences, we organize seminars and lectures, we facilitate workshops, and we form communities of practice with relevant experts, scholars, and practitioners with diverse interests and backgrounds. We envision ourselves as a conduit of individual, collective, systemic, and institutional transformation, where society is transformed through an active engagement in contemplative practices and understandings, which make possible radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation. We envision institutions of higher learning and a society that practices compassion, that pursues justice, and that acts in ways to honor our shared humanity. Tonight's program, highlighting pedagogies of healing and practices of reimagining, and this series are just a small glimpse into the contemplative justice work we're endeavoring to do to make real healing, flourishing, and liberation. As we've been reminded over the course of this series, healing is a battle in which we must all engage if we seek or wish for the restoration of harmony, balance, and equilibrium. This healing is a very physical healing, which alleviates the physical symptoms while also returning to and or entering into right relationship with oneself, the community, the earth, and the spiritual world. Healing is a practice that requires that we use everything. This includes our imaginations. In the medical or scientific community, we often hear of patients in the control group of medical or scientific studies being given a placebo instead of the actual treatment. Scientists have recorded a phenomenon called the placebo effect, where your brain can convince your body that the fake treatment is the real thing and stimulate healing. This is the power of conscious. This is the power of the brain. And I'm sure that our good Dr. Imad can tell us more about all of those things. But why am I mentioning this? Because everything around us, everything we do, everything we use, everything we create, everything we produce comes from our ability to imagine, to think outside of what has been thought and then to produce it. What is made possible if we are able to engage the imagination, to reimagine, to rethink, to disrupt, and to transform systems that are no longer working for how we live, move, and have our being in the world. Tonight, Drs. Imad and Cody Nielsen will help us to synthesize what we have learned about healing ourselves, healing the system of higher education, and reckoning with issues of racial injustice and inequity on American college campuses. They will center pedagogies of healing and practices of reimagining that any member of the college and university can employ to heal themselves, their respective institutions, and their corners of the world. My hope for tonight is that they will help us to recollect what we have learned to forget. And by that, I mean these questions. What it means to be healed. How might we remember ourselves to wholeness? How might we engage with systems, with higher education institutions, with ourselves, with one another, our students, and society differently? I will end my tirade and I will say, let's get started tonight with a brief introduction of each of our guests. I'll read very briefly their bios. Imad received her undergraduate training from the University of Michigan, Dearborn, where she studied philosophy. She received her doctoral degree in cellular and clinical neurobiology from Wayne State University School of Medicine in the Department of Neuroscience. She joined the Department of Life and Physical Life Sciences at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona, as an adjunct faculty member in 2009 and later as a full-time faculty member in 2013. Outside of the classroom, Dr. Imad works with faculty members across disciplines at her own institution and across the country to promote inclusive, equitable, and contextual education, all rooted in the latest research on neurobiology, the neurobiology of learning in particular. A nationally recognized expert in trauma-informed teaching and learning, she passionately advocates for institutions to make mental health a top priority and to systemically support the education of the whole student. We welcome you, Mays. Our next guest in tonight's dialogue is Dr. Cody Nielsen. Cody holds a PhD in higher ed administration from Iowa State University and a master's degrees in mental health counseling and divinity. He is the founder and executive director of Emergence on Campus, a North American volunteer-led social change organization which seeks to dismantle long-standing systems of marginalization of religious, secular, and spiritual identities in higher education. His 2013-2015 study, Multi-Faith in Higher Education, explored the campus climates through a policy and practice lens of over 150 institutions across the United States and Canada. The former expert in residence for religious, secular, and spiritual identities for NASPA, Cody is an emerging voice in national calls for equity of religious minorities and non-religious campus identities on campus. A scholar by practice and not by nature, he says, Cody's dissertation considered the institutional climate of Penn State University and its Pastorella Institute, the largest multi-faith center at an institution of higher education in North America. He is the father to Levi and an avid runner, writer, and board game enthusiast. On weekends, you can find Cody on a bike trail, in a hammock reading, or in the kitchen baking bread or trying out recipes from cookbooks he probably found in a used bookstore. Cody, we welcome you tonight.
Thank you.
I will now get out of the way and allow the two of you to present your opening remarks to us tonight.
I think I'm supposed to go first, and I didn't know you were going to read all of that. I'm really grateful to be here. David, thank you. And Maze, so grateful to be in your presence with you. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. And as I've thought about it, this notion of healing and healing of higher ed and healing of society at large is, as you've already so eloquently sort of shared with us, such a big, expansive, and what I think I've heard in the sustainability world we call wicked problems. Like, how does one solve such a big, huge issue? And I think about this question of healing from the question of humanity. I always am struck on a sort of consistent daily basis by the fact that we have to heal ourselves by recognizing our own humanity and by giving ourselves permission to be human, for us to have permission to fail, to succeed, to grow, to accept the fact that forgiveness and that restorative justice practices are for us just as much as they are for others, that we sort of impart these sort of senses of care and concern for others, but also this sort of self-care. But going back to this sort of healing and this sort of humanity question, I often think from a systemic and structural lens of really living in sort of the work of Paulo Freire, and that sort of simple question that Freire asks and sort of questions whether humanity's greatest flaw is our inability to see each other as human, and that ultimately our dehumanization tendencies are breaking us, and not just breaking us individually, but breaking us as an entire species, as an entire society, as an entire world. And so, you know, from this conversation, I hope that part of what our opportunity presenting, especially in a higher ed world, is for us to think about ways in which we can remind ourselves that we're all human. And I'll just share briefly that one example of this that I will put to us and challenge, and I hope we have time to talk about it more later, is that as we move into these later stage pandemic moments, and as we recognize how broken we are, and it's not as though we were any less broken before, it's just that the scars in many ways have been exposed so deeply by what I describe as a 3 pandemic moment, not just COVID-19, And not even just COVID-19 plus the presence of racism, but also the climate change concern and the global concerns around this, and that our brokenness is really stemming in such a larger structural way. One of the things that I think about on college campuses in real specific focus is the notion of who we are there for and what is higher education about. And I will often say that if we are to heal ourselves, if we are to restore higher education, as what Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the famous study of Islamic studies at the University of Toronto, once described as the most important invention of the second millennia, I think first and foremost, we must heal ourselves by realizing that we are all part of the story. And I think that the greatest breakdown of that often happens in little minute, microaggressive and implicit biases ways. But I'm often struck by when we say that among staff and faculty, and when those of us that are professionals are working in higher ed, we often say, we're here for the students, which gives limitless boundaries for us to be taken advantage of, limitless boundaries for us as professionals to be dehumanized by simply saying that our job is to pour ourselves out. And I will say that that's one specific way in which I hope that we can have some conversation about healing and say, it's not that we are not here for students, but that we in this field of higher education specifically are imparting some level of a society wherein we are creating knowledge, holding knowledge, and disseminating knowledge, and that it's all of us together. And so if we're only here for the students, if you will, then it actually dehumanizes ourselves. So I'm going to stop. That's a lot of opening statements. Mays has probably much more profound thoughts than I have this evening, but I will pause from there.
Thank you, Cody. Nice.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm going to stay with this question of human and what it means to be human. And I'm actually going to share, I prepared some slides that I want to share with you. And I'm going to share with you a quote from a student. This is part of a study that I did where I asked students to describe what's a good learning environment. And this is one of the students writing that higher education expects students and professors to drop everything when in the classroom, but their personal lives are a part of them, because daily lives are filled with emotional events that represent them. What I learned from that study is that for students to believe, to see, to feel that they're having an optimal learning environment or a good learning environment, they wanted to be seen, and they wanted the environment, their professors, their advisors, to also feel that they are being seen. This question of being human. So it's very interesting because in the Arabic language, insan, the word for human, it comes from the root word, which could give rise to one who forgets, or being in comfort with, or being in the company where you feel comfortable. So I always thought that insan, or human being, is one who has a tendency to forget and also has the capacity to provide comfort and home and security for others. And let's talk about education and being human in education. When James Baldwin gave a speech on education, he asked the audience, do you want to know why Black people are protesting, are out in the streets? And he goes on and he says, we want to be able to live and practice our humanity just like you do. And so this question of being human, I wanna stay with that. So I'm gonna read for you. This is from an article written by a sociologist. In the 1980s, the Los Angeles Police Department and law enforcement used the acronym NHI to informally classify cases involving the murder of sex workers, drug users, gang members, or homeless persons. The majority of those from Black and Brown populations, those cases were giving low or no priority because their victims are regarded as having a low or no social status. NHI stands for no human involved. This is part of a letter that Sylvia Winter, sociologist, wrote to her colleagues at Stanford called No Humans Involved, an open letter to my colleagues. In the letter, she says it was therefore the roles of these systemic cognitive distortions to provide the mode of truth. Yet where did the system of classification come from? How did they come to conceive what it means to be human? In another part, Winter talks about, again, the notion of humanity. Here she says, empire's most powerful apparatus is the education system. It initiates us into a culture and knowledge system that instructs us to want to be of a specific ethnoclass of humanity. The tragedy of this is that whilst this particular idea of being optimally human holds us together as Americans, it can do so only in terms of us and then not us. So she goes on and says, we cannot give up writing stories about what it means to be human that displace those that are at the foundation of empire. There is no order in the world that can exist or hold together, including an empire, without a founding story. Now, the question for academia in the 21st century is, will you make space within it to be able to write a new foundation? So when I think about higher education, when I think about the academy, one of the things that come to mind immediately and to heart is that there is a heartbreak. We have been part of a system that has perpetuated isms, racisms, for example. And we use a lot of euphemism and we use a lot of analogies to pacify it. We have initiatives and we talk about healing and we talk about turning a new page, a new normal, this and that. And one of the things that I still haven't seen at a larger scale is that we're not taking a very deep look at the complicity of higher education and where we are. So on the question of healing, healing is from the root word whole. And what higher education has done for too long is it has perpetuated this lie that we can expect students and faculty and staff to compartmentalize. And so when a student comes to the class to study physiology, and the night before there was a shooting of an unarmed Black person that impacts that student and her community, and I just expect that she would turn the page and sit and listen and learn. I'm being delusional. And that's what we've done for too long. So Winter argues for the vitality of reconsidering what constitutes knowledge in academia in the face of racial, economic, and environmental justice. So in this really, I want to say, challenging, heartbreaking, and also precious moment, I want to offer that we need to pause and ask audacious questions, such as, what Pumla Gubodo-Madikizela says, what does it mean to be human in the aftermath of mass trauma and violence? And what Winter asks us to do is, how can we marry our thoughts so that we can now pose the question of whose answers can resolve the plight of the jobless archipelagos, the NHI categories, and the environment. So in moving forward, we need to go beyond DEI initiatives. We need to ask ourselves. For me, I have been sitting and asking difficult and audacious and painful questions like, what have I been doing? What lies have I been perpetuating? How have I forgotten what it means to be human? And what othering have I been participating in? So I'm going to pause right here and hand it over back to you, David. And I hope we could continue asking those questions.
Thank you, Mace. Those are important questions, right? That we have to ask ourselves, not only within institutions of higher learning, right, but within all of our institutions and systems, right? It extends beyond that. And the point that you made around the complicity of higher education in promoting some of these things, right, is what we don't talk about enough. Primarily, I would say primarily because it's what pays our bills, right? And so there is a fear around having those conversations because of the need for economic stability. But I think perhaps, right, maybe not. But I want to get Cody's response to what you have said here today, especially around on what it means to be a human being. Right?
So, Maze, you said that so eloquently, and there are so many things that I want to think about. I might live in this space. I'm such a administrator by heart. I am sort of, as you introduced me, as a sort of working scholar, and it's very interesting because as you talk about the complicity, I think about the narrative and the way in which higher education has shaped its narrative. Throughout history of higher education has been arguably the seedbed for so many areas of social progress. The Vietnam era protests, civil rights, the LGBT movement, even back as far as women's suffrage, found deep rootedness on college campuses. And that's the narrative that I think is told. Now, many of us in this space here will know that if we take back to the origins of higher ed, about the ways in which folks like Craig T. Wilder in his book, Ebony and Ivy, talk about the entangled history of America's racism being built on college campuses, and that our settler colonialism is in part due to the Western manifest destiny and the sort of not only the sort of pockmarking the landscape of these early, mostly Protestant and white Protestant institutions of higher learning, but also were reinforced through the educational structures of the savagery of Native Americans and of persons of color, especially Black slaves in America. We know those stories, but then we sort of quit. It's that sort of classic, like, slavery was ended at the end of the Civil War, and then we had civil rights. It's that sort of like struggle. And I think about the way in which you talk about the complicity of it, because I think the narrative of higher education has been that we have been this place where so much transformation takes place in our society. But the complicity of it and the reality of it is that higher education has never been at the forefront of social change. It has always been the grinding stone on which social change has to be activated and motivated. And I think you just so aptly described it. Is higher education ready to meet the moment? When, as an administrator, I am told, you can help students to like organize, but you can't stand on the picket line with them. You can't cross that line. Why? Because to do so is to defy the institution itself. So the institution then has already decided upon its positionality, that it will always be not on the side of progress. It will always be complicit, but also very stationary. And I think that's one of the great issues of healing in this field. Will we actually activate ourselves, or will we not? I will say, and I will call out current systems on this, and you know, who knows if somebody will be mad about this, but in the recent months, with the economic structures of higher education revealing themselves in this great resignation, and with the understanding of the economic disparity amongst our staff and faculty and our individuals on staff who are well underpaid, certain organizations in this field, even though the Biden administration called for increased in base salaries amongst folks, certain professional associations signed letters in opposition of basic increases in pay, detailing that there are folks in our field who these large professional associations run by folks with enormous salaries in themselves and wielding significant power think that it's okay for someone with a master's degree to be paid $30,000 and $35,000 a year to do a professional role. If we're going to heal ourselves, we're going to have to heal ourselves by understanding our own scarredness inside. And we're going to have to think about the ways in which that manifests on our campuses and trains our students that we are not here to actually meet the moment of social change. We're literally hiding behind our old ways of doing and not actually progressively like coming to the forefront of like social change. I got a little tangential there, so I'm going to stop.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up some interesting points there, right? But what I would say is that the economic issues of higher education stem from this question, right? Which I study from the Ubuntu and Buddhist perspective, especially in higher education. And that one question is, what does it mean to be a human being? And what does it mean, right, to be in right relationship with other human beings? And depending on the answer to that, right, depending on the answer to what it means to be a human being, then we can treat human beings well or not treat them well, right? Or we have this view that Sylvia Winter so beautifully pointed out in that letter to our colleagues, right? That we literally have systems who can see other human beings who are 99.5% like them as not human, right? There's a basic philosophical undercurrent that is for lack of a better word, effed up across institutions, and especially in the global West, right? We have this issue. And institutions, in my estimation, are also promoting this fragmentation, right? We privilege the mind over embodiment, right? In the case of, I'm going to go on a tangent too. In the case of Winter, you know, she does an excellent job in all of her writing, calling this out, right? And of calling out how institutions dehumanize. And the sticking point about institutions is that it could give a damn about you, but it cares about its own survival by any means necessary, right? So in work that I do outside of CMI, I'm trying to disrupt, burn down, tear down, dismantle, brick by brick, these institutions because they don't serve us anymore, right? And I don't think they ever did. But we're coming to a new understanding of how we can be differently in the world, some of us. And that's what we want to talk about tonight, right? Like, how do we get there? Right? How do we get folks to come along with us in this process? Right? The fact that higher education practices de jure and de facto segregation, racism is not a surprise, right? It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It's also where eugenics emerged, right? So, I mean, let's, like, the history of these things. We don't talk about those things, but I'm going to be quiet. And I want us to go back to that question around what it means to be a human being. And Maze, that question you put up from our dear African sister about what does it mean to be human after trauma?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be human after mass violence? You know, I love that question from her, and I often think we haven't gotten there yet. So we don't have a question, we don't have an answer to it. Right?
Well, I think in this moment of I think global agony, you know, whether you want to call it we're experiencing collective trauma or not, it's debatable, but certainly we're experiencing individually and collectively agitation and discomfort. And you know, this notion of being human, whether it's Winter or Baldwin or Pumla, it's audacious because it invites us to consider that whatever definition we're operating with is perhaps a status quo, and we shouldn't settle. So when I first started learning about the West African philosophy of what it means to be human, their conception of science and medicine, their understanding, when I started, you know, traveling and observing and working with indigenous healers, one of the things that happened is I felt wounded. I felt that I was that some of the education I received was it didn't tell me the full story. It was very narrow. It was very reductionist. And I remember talking with one of my teachers from Ghana, and he described the way he views electrons. I'm an electrophysiologist, so we're talking about electrons. And it was like time stood still for me, because I thought, what a vast, complex, imaginative, creative, daring way of understanding. It's this dancing with this liminal space. And what a narrow linear way that I had, constricted way that I had. So the heartbreak was, I felt that I haven't been told the full story. So when I think about back to this question of what it means to be human, it's aspiring for more. It's aspiring to shatter the status quo and really dig deep. Do you want to just have a superficial taste of what it means to be, or do you want to really embody it? So when I work with students, I say to them, don't listen to the news or look at social media. And they're telling you one narrative, that we are selfish, that we are driven by, money, money, money. We're competitive, we're this, we're that. Look for another narrative. This is what Winter says. There's this other narrative of community-based, of love and connection and relationality and playfulness and imagination. We're also capable of that. We are here tonight in this virtual space because we aspire for more. We want more. And what Rumi says, what you are looking for is within you. What you are seeking is seeking you. So there is this justice and beauty and love there's an affinity both ways that we have. And I know I'm speaking very theoretically, but we could bring this down from the theoretical to practically speaking. What does this mean? And I'd say, well, for me, baby steps. How does it show up in my curriculum? I teach science. Do I pause and say, all right, young scientist here, let's consider, what does it mean to be human? And when I started bringing this to the classroom, and I did it with some trepidation, because I thought, what are they going to think? They want more. They want more, the students. And so I don't think we're going to arrive at an answer per se. I mean, perhaps healing is something that we're always working towards, right? We're always working towards this wholeness. But I think part of this healing is not settling. It's always pausing and wondering and marrying our thoughts, as Winter says, to those on the margins. But not just marrying our thoughts. Really, it's not just an imagination, it's an action as well.
Maze, you're just so eloquent. I'm sitting here like I am almost speechless, because I think, admittedly, like the way in which you just framed that we're here because we want more. We want to be more. Yeah, whoever just said this, Tom over here, this embodied poetic imagination. I was sitting here and I would be remiss if I didn't say that in this Zoom environment, it gives me the ability to sort of contemplate this conversation in live, like motion with myself. And so I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about the poet David Whyte, and I was thinking about his poem, Everything is Waiting for You. And I feel compelled to read it in this space. He says these words. He says, your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone, as if life were a progressive and cunning crime with no witness to the tiny hidden transgressions. To feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of your surroundings. Surely even you at times have felt the grand array, the swelling presence, and the chorus crowding out your solo voice. You must note the way the soap dish enables you, or the window latch grants you freedom. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. The stairs are your mentor of things to come. The doors have always been there to frighten you and to invite you. and the tiny speaker on the phone is your dream ladder to divinity. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as it pours you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. All the birds and creatures of the world are utterly themselves. Everything is waiting for you. I am so, this is so wonderful to be in space with you. I think so often about the community and the connection and the relationality. As someone who's not a faculty member, though is an instructor and teaches, I often tell people that I can't imagine working in higher education without being in the classroom. But I also can't imagine working in higher education without being outside of the classroom. That if the only thing that we did was tell students to go to class, then what the hell is it that we're doing? Because, and I tell this to parents all the time who spend exorbitant amounts of money that we have, that we have asked of them, and students themselves and many other family members and friends that help support these folks, that you're not really there for the degree. Yes, it's the bookend from one end to the next. But God help us if we don't know that some ways deep down, what we really remember from our experience of higher ed is not sitting in the classroom and learning some more theory. And both of us are educators, so I hope that's not offensive to anyone, that it's not just what we learn in the classroom. But many of us explored our own sexuality in college. Many of us understood our relationship, what it meant to be in our identity, our sexual identities, our relationship with alcohol, our understanding of whether we are as simple as being introverted or extroverted, the ability for us to navigate complex social relationships. Like, I remember being up till 2 a.m. with so many friends, doing so many things that I can tell you here and I can't tell you here. But that was what it was about, being human, about making mistakes and about living in those mistakes and about doing great, amazing things, about taking my friend who was Filipino out in the middle of November at 2 a.m. during the first snowfall, the first time that he ever saw snow. I'll never forget that. If we can be human in higher education, if our institutes of higher learning can help us to reframe that community and connection and relationality and give us space to be human, and if we can keep that pace of slowing down long enough and not getting lost into the business of higher education and not lost into the business of just preparing people to go out and get jobs, then we can change the entire pace of our society. Everything can become about the community orientation. A few weeks ago, I saw this meme that said, you remember that time where you remembered that residential hall living or living in dorms was the last time that you would ever be next door to all your friends and like just down the hallway from all these people that you knew? We can change all that, which was a response to the question about housing in America, about the issues of housing in America. We don't have to make community living a one-time occurrence. I'm sitting in my office with so many books behind me, and I'll tell you, I could imagine that if I needed in my own mind to buy a house just so I could house all my books, but then I could also live in community with a number of people who could share those books, because most of the times I won't read these books. But I just think that what you're saying, Maze, has so much of a point, that we have this opportunity in living in trauma and living through violence to really reimagine our entire society, but we have to do it now. And we have to realize higher education's potential and the potential moment that we're in. And I'm just very thankful to be thinking about this and processing this with you.
You know,
Go ahead.
no, I'm just reminded, and I'll make this brief. Desmond Tutu says, I learned to be human from other human beings. And he doesn't put a condition on which human beings, right? So whether it's Winter or Desmond Tutu, they beckon us to dig deep into this relational empathy, this ability to learn, to cultivate, to fine tune our humanity. So one of the things I do, and I started slowly and strategically bringing this to the classroom, is when something happens in society, something that impacts a community that is historically underserved, that has and continues to experience a lot of racism and violence. I have a meditative exercise where I ask myself, how is it injuring me? Right? Because our humanity is dependent on one another. So I started bringing this to the classroom at a smaller scale, and then I take it higher and higher. And I initially said, and I bring it around the time where we do the cardiovascular system. And so we talk about the heart and the relationality and the electromagnetic field around the heart and how we impact each other. We're relational. And then I say, so how do you think it impacts you when a student in the class fails? And I, changes the average, this and that, I get, and then I push further, say more, think about it more. I send them home with this homework, and they eventually come back and they say, well, they may have to drop and the class is not the same anymore, right? And then with every exercise, with every lesson, with every module, I want to go beyond the classroom and this topic and this narrow and this, and talk about, all right, there is a community out there and we're part of that community. What kind of ripple effect can we have, right? In the Muslim tradition, I grew up with, it says, al-mar'u mir'atu akhi. It is, human being is the mirror of each other. And so when I sit with you, David or Cody, or I sit and you can help me look at my humanity as I do yours. And so this relationality, trauma, if you want to say, we're at a moment where we're dealing with trauma, individual, collective, is a relational issue. And healing is also relational.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mace. I think it's Bell Hooks who reminds us that healing is a communal exercise. Right? It is a communal practice, and that comes from a deep understanding. In my own work, I talk about Ubuntu and socially engaged Buddhism, right? And you raised up Archbishop Tutu. May his memory be a blessing always, right? But he is so deeply, he embodied Ubuntu, right? He embodied this understanding that that we are not born human, but made human, as you so wonderfully said, in relationship with one another, right? And that I am but a mirror of my brother or sister. And in fact, there is no other, as Tutu would say, right? That we are, period. And the issues the points that you've raised, Cody, about higher education, right? And I think it's Ian Thompson who says that the knowledge we pursue shapes our being in the world, right? The knowledge we pursue shapes our being in the world. And Thompson goes on to say that when our understanding of beings changes historically, and our understanding of what education is transforms as well, right? So Mays, your centering what it means, that question, what it means to be a human being, is so critical. One of the reasons why this series situated healing within higher education, right, is because of that understanding from Ian Thompson about the knowledge we pursue shaping our being in the world, right? And we see this in a number of ways, right? I can walk into a room and tell you who went to Harvard just by the way they presented themselves, their standing, the way they have been shaped by those environments. And so we have to change the environment to shape people differently, right? So my question in all of that is going back to David White's poem, which is one of my favorite, right? My favorite line in that poem is, what does he say? Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. And in both of your work, you bring an awareness, an alertness, right, to this relational nature, the interconnectedness of all beings and of all things. What I want to ask is, and maybe you began to answer this, how do you bring that forth, right? How do you bring forth or produce an environment, or the spaciousness of an environment, right, where folks can engage in the process of healing, even when they don't know they need to be healed?
Well, I'd say one has to experience it. I have to experience it. I remember a teacher of mine said, you can't give what you don't have.
Amen.
And another teacher said, if you want to, Eric Bedoso from Benin, I asked him, how can I become a better educator? And he said, well, education's like healing. When you want to become a healer, you must begin by forgetting about yourself. And what he was telling me, forget about your assumptions, forget about your biases, forget about, really dig deeper. What does it mean to be whole? What does it mean to be human? We're here because on a Thursday night, not because someone's making us, but because I will say, I don't know, do I want to bet my next paycheck that every person on this call is here because we're disenchanted. We aspire for something better. We know there's something better. We want that whole, that healing. We want to taste the sweetness of that togetherness. So I think recognizing the injuries that we are experiencing and have experienced, and rather than just saying, I'm going to take a Tylenol for it, go deeper. How did this injury, and how does it affect me? And what do I play? What role do I? So, I can't be a healer without experiencing the pain and the trauma and also the healing. And like I said, it's not like we reach a final goal and done, we're done. No, it's a process. it's a process, it's ongoing, it must be organic, regenerative, and so on. And I also think, as you said, centering the community, for me, the classroom, I don't have a hierarchy, right? The students, I want to empower them to heal themselves and each other, and myself, it's relational. Yesterday, we were doing an experiment. We're doing an experiment on heart rate variability and regulating the autonomic nervous system. We've been like doing this for, at least couple of months, and the system crashed, and I was going to lose it. And one of the students said, he said, let's do a heart focus exercise, right? Oh my goodness, he centered me, right? So I think I would say that, to baby step, but intentional baby steps, deliberate, transparent, explicit. We aspire for more. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking back to your original question. David, would you ask it again, just in this question and this framing of where you asked us?
Oh, Cody, I forgot that. This is a problem with questions I don't write down, right? But essentially, it was how do we bring about or create space or the container for these environments for healing, even when they don't know they need to be healed.
So one of the things that's really interesting from my end is I'm thinking about this from in the classroom setting. And I think, Mays, I think you offer such that example, that sort of heart healing exercise, and again, the small steps, or as if any of you have ever seen the movie Contact, as Ellie is told by her father, small moves, Ellie, small moves, like little steps at a time. But I also think backward. One of the things I have upcoming this summer is that I'm getting a tattoo right here on my wrist of what is known as a sankafa. And a sankafa, for those of you that may not know, SANKOFA, you'll probably look this up. For those of you that don't know, is a mythical Ghanaian bird that walks forward while looking backward, and is sometimes personified with a nut or something in its mouth. And in Ghanaian, it is said that it is not bad to go back and fetch that which has been left behind. And it is a deep reminder of our history. In the classes that I teach on what I call religious, secular, and spiritual equity, one of the ways in which I talk about healing, and one of the ways in which I talk about trauma, is about recognizing our history. Recognizing that before there was racism, there was the creation of race. And that white, Protestant, and Catholic communities were in many ways the creators of race. And that as much as that might not be healing in the moment, it's healing through first telling our history. And by recognizing the history and the pain that has to come, because healing has to know where it's deeply rooted from in some ways. And part of the reason that I want to bring this up is because I believe that history is what we hold, and that history is that which must be told. I think many of our students today, especially our students of color today, who have come of age during the times of Ferguson, during the times of George Floyd, during the times of all of those who have been murdered by police, one of our historical moments that is ironic that I realize today is present in the midst of this for those of us that are old enough to remember is that tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the LA riots and the lack of conviction of the 4 police officers who brutally assaulted and nearly murdered Rodney King. And how can we heal if we don't remember that? If we don't tell the authenticness of that history and that moment? And that's the opportunity that we have in this field, not as a weapon, at least for harm and triggering and trauma, but rather that if we tell the truth, that in itself gives us the chance to be free, to be more. And what greater opportunity than to tell our authentic history and to tell the work of Desmond Tutu and what happened around apartheid and what happened to heal South Africa and what even Rodney King tried to offer in terms of an attempt to heal. But we have to tell that history. We can't just gloss over it. And we certainly can't imagine that history only began for our students 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, even 25 years ago.
Wow. Yes, thanks, May. So the letter that Mays brought forward from Sylvia Winter was in response to that King verdict. Which so powerful that the universe knows what it's doing always. It's always synchronicity there. I want to move us into the question and answer period. And so I want to encourage folks in the audience again to ask your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to begin with a question from Bo Karen Lee, who had this question at the very beginning, Mays, when you were talking about the Arabic definition and understanding of human, right? And so Bo Karen asks to forget what things, right? And as we provide comfort and company for others. And then she goes on to say, who forgets what things, right? As they bring comfort and companionship to others. So I think the question is, who forgets and what do they forget?
David, I didn't hear you. Would you repeat the question, please?
Of course. So this, the question from Bo Karen Lee came from the beginning in your opening remarks, where you mentioned that to be human in an Arabic understanding was to forget and to comfort. Mm-hmm. And Bo Karen's question is, who forgets? What are they forgetting? Mm. And as we bring comfort and companionship to ourselves or to others?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have the capacity, we have the propensity to wander and forget, go into, if you will, a state of heedlessness. We just disconnect. Forget what? Forget our interdependence, forget our humanity, forget our interconnectedness. Forget what really matters. And yet we have the potential to really transcend and demystify that sacred relationality. And and in doing so, we provide comforts for ourselves and others. And the difference between the two, I think, is, well, I mean, is being in a vigilant state of reflection, contemplation. In Saubono, the greeting in South Africa, when you see, sorry?
I was responding back to you.
Yeah. It's, I see you. And then you reply to me, Yabo Saubono, I see you too. So it's this ancient remembering where we came from, our interconnectedness, our relationality. It's this vigilant awareness. And it's really easy to lose that in our constant go, deadlines and competition and so on. So one of the things to go into that state of remembrance and offer that comfort for ourselves and others, what some scholars have been calling for is pausing. So West African philosopher and teacher and healer, Bayo Ekumulafi says, the times are urgent. It is important to pause. So I hope that answers the question.
Of course, Bo Karen has a follow-up question. So Bo Karen writes, it seemed that to be human is to remember. And I would say in that writing, it is re-member, right? And not just remember then. But I thought forgetting was essential to that original definition of what it meant to be a human being, is what she asked.
Yeah, so there is, I mean, forgetting what? Okay, and when my mentor says you must begin by forgetting about yourself, I mean, the self has many layers, you know, the soul, the ego, the heart, the spirit. And he was talking about the ego. Now, he wasn't saying deny your ego, erase the ego. It's don't go in with all of your assumptions and go, he says, always go to the classroom like a child. Wonder. He said, walk into the classroom, be a child. Wonder what the students are bringing. He was, so they're different forgetting. Okay. And also, and there is, I recognize the seeming dichotomy or contradiction. To be human is to remember. And there's also the forgetting, okay? And some of the forgetting is necessary and some of it could prevent that remembering, the wholeness.
Yeah. It puts me in mind of Cynthia Dillard's book, Learning to Remember the Things We've Learned to Forget, right? And the book centers Ubuntu and community and all of those wisdom traditions about learning to re-member, right, ourselves to the whole. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Lisa Petro. And Lisa writes, transformation is both destructive and constructive. Some things must be destroyed for new things to be birthed. In your opinions, what needs to go in higher education first, second, and third? What should be birthed into being first, second, and third? Those questions always get me. I'm like, I don't know. Go ahead.
I don't know what to say. I think practically, if there was a way to start that, one thing that I would like to destroy is, well, twofold. How about this? First and foremost, I'd like to destroy the presumption that higher education is simply a stamp making factory that has degrees, that's what it is. I have often said, as I sort of look at the sort of politicization of higher education, and I think it's gone slightly more quiet with Trump out of office, but definitely when he was in office, there was such an enormous permission slip that was written to sort of attack higher education at large. And I often said, part of this is higher education's fault. They're failing to tell people what they are. But part of it is because they're failing to know what they are. And I return to that quote by Wilfred Cantwell Smith that he once said that higher education potentially could be the most important invention of the second millennium. And he goes on to say, for without it, there would never have been any number of individuals, including folks like Sir Isaac Newton, as well as so many others. Higher education is this manifestation of a society in micro form, but it doesn't tell anybody that it is. Instead, it allows itself to be narrated of in this way. So one thing that I would say to deconstruct is the disallowment and the failure of higher education to name its potential, to name itself as more than that. And again, you see this whole thing about the public trust of higher education and what it's supposed to be about sort of global citizenship and for the common good and all these things, and it loses that. Another thing I would say that's sort of the practical on the ground, and again, I'm not in the existential right now, I'm living in the practical just on the, as we're talking about this from a sort of 1, 2, 3, is that I have throughout my career, who has been an administrator, but obtained a PhD for the explicit purposes of moving into a realm of faculty, whether that be, not full-time and only sort of part-time or others, is that the divide between faculty and non-faculty is offensive to me. The idea that one side of the house is the most important thing, that this one entity or this one thing, it reminds me so much of looking at like our American political system. You're either a Republican or a Democrat. You're either a staff or a faculty, and both sides go to war with each other. And when you say we're on the same team, people look at each other and they say, are you sure? Because the other side has all the power in this situation. And I find that to be absolute ridiculousness. We're at war with ourselves. And so practically the deconstruction of that for me is destroying those narratives, that to be a faculty is to educate and to be a staff is to, I don't know, like just do programming, whatever the hell it is that people think that we do over here. So those are things that are coming to my mind in my practical lens. We'll go back to Maze now, who will help us live in the existential frame so much deeper.
What is coming to my heart right now is, you asked for 3 things. Number 1, I would say we cannot ignore the question of reparation. And its complexities and its possibilities and messiness. We cannot just put a Band-Aid and assume that we could just move on and ignore the intergenerational ramifications of systematic exclusion of other humans from the academy. I would say the second one is, so you asked what needs to go first, second, third. So I would say we need to get rid of our, first, we need to get rid of our ignoring that aspect. I would say second, get rid of our collective ambivalence about the environment and where we're heading. And I would say the third one, we have to get rid of the way adjunct faculty are paid and treated, and adjunct and non-tenure and part-time, and right. I worked at an institution that had 1,300 faculty members, 1,000 of which are adjunct faculty. They carried the institutions. They didn't have health insurance. They lived paycheck to paycheck. That is inhumane. Talk about what does it mean to be human? It injured me, continues to. It makes me feel, well, not about me. So I'd say those. And the theme to all of them is justice, but not just justice. I would say beauty also, right? Because justice is beautiful when done justly.
I think it's James Finley who says justice is the outflow of a broken heart. Right? And so love has to be, in there. I would add that Lisa didn't ask me that question, but I'd add to that question that even outside of higher education, there has to be this central question that Mace raised: a new understanding of what it means to be a human being, a different understanding of subjectivity. Right? And an understanding that our enemies are not men and women, but ideas, right? And we have to begin to ask ourselves, who do we want to live with, right? How do we want to live? Who and how will we be forced to live if we continue on this path? And what we know is that an idea can outlive a human being by millennia, right? So the ideas, the grounding philosophies, all of those things, I think, need to be reformulated, rethought, transformed. And what we know about things is that transformation, while it can be destructive in one sense, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It changes form. Right? And you can take that energy, put it together differently, and get a completely different thing. And so that's what I'm hoping we can do. All right. Brenda asks, could you share your pedagogical practices for centering these ideas in your learning context, classroom and otherwise?
I'm a neuroscientist, so I see the world through the lens of the brain, and I bring that with me. And I tell the students, no meaningful learning happens. I tell them that at the beginning of the semester, middle of the semester, all the time. No meaningful learning happens if you don't feel safe and connected. And so, I say, how are we going to create safety here? I'm always asking the questions. And I always say, if I'm having an off day and I'm just having a really hard time, I say I'm having an off day, and I ask you to bear with me, and I bring it back to safety and connections. And the connections is I'm always asking, what does this have to do with the world? Why should you care about this topic? Why should you? And so I do a lot of these metacognitive exercises where, I pause and I tell them why this matters to me, why it matters to the world, how I form connection with this topic or that topic, why I struggle with this topic. And then it's almost like I'm building up, right? I have an agenda. By the middle of the semester, I want to feel comfortable. And I want the students to feel comfortable with me bringing in words like love and justice in a science classroom. By the end of the semester, I want the students to feel comfortable to ask me, what was the socio and political and geographical context that was happening when that experiment was taking place in the 1960s. So it's really, I'm building up. I have a vision. I have I have an agenda, and my agenda is beyond what is written in the book, in the textbook. It's really to get the student to leave the classroom and say, what was that about? What does it mean to be human? Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I have a better answer for that. I feel like I want to say that I center these ideas by disrupting the classroom, by climbing on a desk and saying, "Captain, my captain," and just, inviting people to Dead Poets Society. But like, I don't feel like I have time to respond to that, because I think Mays has responded it to, so aptly.
I love that. Thank you. I would say too, what both of you have described about your classroom practices, right, is the practice of seeing. And I think you raised that early. I go back to that, to the Oprah interview with Toni Morrison, where Oprah asked Toni, what does it take to be a good parent, right? And Toni Morrison's response was, all your children want to know is, do your eyes light up when they walk into a room? Do you see them, right? And so if you can practice some presence in that space. As a professor, the way I do that is that we do a 2-minute check-in, where folks can opt in and opt out, but they have 2 minutes in their day. I teach doc students mostly, who are parents and spouses and have full-time jobs. And the feedback I get is that this is the only time in the week where they have to center themselves. Right? How do you model that? And that's one way of doing it. Our last question for the night is from Laura Hill. Thank you, Laura. I'm grappling with disengaged students who are checked out and not showing up in person to engage with their peers. I offer virtual live stream, but it's not the same experience. Do you have suggestions on how to reach these students?
So I have been doing this since I started teaching, that I have a requirement. So I offer a lot of participation points in my classes, a lot of percentage worth of participation points. But I'm also a person, and I'm a pretty big extrovert, that I say on the first day of class that I recognize that people have different learning styles. And so, yes, there are people that are ready, and I have students that have joked with me that I had students this semester make a bingo card of all of the things that I did in the classroom. And one of them was that when people answered questions, I said yes and pointed at them. And then so I felt like I was like a game show host, is what they said. So I do like the interaction. But one of the pieces that I have is that I have this weekly reflection paper, or at least bi-weekly, that I have this reflection paper that I ask them to write. 2 pages, double spaced, on anything. All they have to do is to write it. And it's my active way to have a conversation with them. They can tell me that they're having a really shitty week. They can tell me that they had a bad breakup. They can tell me that they just didn't do the readings. Or they can have a conversation with me about things in the classroom that they didn't feel like they understood, didn't feel confident enough to ask the question. And from that conversation, I am very consistent about reach outs and consistent back and forth conversation. And I think that is the way in which I am keeping people engaged, because I am cognizant at every moment, as much as I can be, of the experiences of each of these students individually, as much as I am trying to build that sort of collective sense. And admittedly, as disengaged and as burned out as these students have been, today, for example, I had a class that was missing about 20% of the class, but every single student emailed me. Every single one communicated with me and both apologized for missing, but also shared what was happening and why they weren't there. And that was like authentic. Nobody was just missing in action. And here we are at the end of maybe the hardest of all years. So I feel like I did a little bit something right, maybe.
Thank you, Cody. Yeah, it's, one of those, one of the ways through that as well, right, is what I found is acknowledging that acknowledgement piece, right? I have been in classrooms where professors did not say good morning, did not know my name to say it, right? And then the professor expected me to be engaged in the classroom when you treat me like a stone and not a human being, where you walk right past me and I'm not even there, right? And I've seen this happen time and time and time again, especially in environments that are not heavily staffed with people from the global majority, right? There is this lack of acknowledgement. And so what I tell folks all the time is that if you want to get it, you got to give it, right? This is about reciprocity in that respect, right? About acknowledging the other person, right? We have come to the end of our time. We've come to the end of our time. And the questions are still coming in, right? Please allow me, Cody, Mays, to extend my sincerest gratitude for tonight's informative, eye-opening, heartfelt, moving, embodied, poetic, imaginative conversation around what it means to be a human being, around healing and wholeness and practices of reimagining. I also want to thank behind the scenes our two wonderful human beings who have put this thing on in the truest sense of the word, Carrie Bergman and Karen Blair. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This could not have been done without the two of you. I also would like to draw your attention to the chat. There will be a survey link placed in the chat. And I would not be a good executive director if I did not hit you up for some cash while I have you on the line, right? So there will also be a donation link dropped in the chat box. And we encourage you, if you enjoyed tonight's program, to give to CMIND to make sure that we can continue this good work. I also would like to remind you about summer session. Our 18th annual summer session is coming up at the beginning of August. Be on the lookout for more about that. My wish for you is that you will sit, you will pause, you will give rest, you will breathe, you will cry, you will sob if you need to, you will walk, you will run, you will imagine, you will pray, you will view this world in awe, curiosity, and radical amazement. Until then, be well, be still, trust in the infinite, remember our shared humanity, be community, question everything, and be of good courage. Good night.